Hi, my name is Issandr El Amrani. I blog at Arabist.net. I'm a journalist and political analyst speaking to you from Cairo, Egypt. I write for The Economist, for Foreign Policy, for various other publications, and have written about the issue of democracy, democratic reform or lack of reform in the Arab world, especially in Egypt, but also in Morocco and in North Africa. I'm joined by Shadi Hamid in Doha.
Yeah, hi Issandr. How are you? My name is Shadi Hamid. I'm the Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center and a Fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. Hi Issandr, it's really great to finally sort of talk to you live. We've been emailing back and forth over the last couple of years. Good to finally have a more direct interaction.
I know, it's good. Shadi and I have had these policy debates online, offline, various places, but and I appreciate his work a lot.
So should we get started then? There's a lot certainly to talk about. We saw
Absolutely, yeah.
either a revolution or a would-be revolution in Tunisia.
Yeah, it seems a bit premature to say, to call it a revolution. It was certainly a popular uprising, and it's quite an emotional moment, not only for Tunisians, but for a lot of people, at least in North Africa, in the Maghreb countries where they have a lot of affinity with Tunisia. To see an uprising, not a coup, not humanitarian interventionism, not a country's political system being disturbed by another, but a genuine popular uprising to get rid of I think, and Zine Abidine can unequivocally be called a tyrant.
Exactly. And just to give some background to our viewers who might not be following 100% on this, protests in Tunisia were sparked, I think, December 17th, right? Where a young unemployed Tunisian set himself on fire, and this was sort of the catalyzing event that provoked protests and riots throughout Tunisia, spreading through various regions and finally to the capital. And just 2 days ago, the longtime president, who's been in power since 1987, fled to Saudi Arabia. And as Issandr is saying, this is a first. This is a historic event. It's a first for the Arab world.
That's right, and this is an event that has obviously a lot of people in the neighboring countries thinking, could it happen here? It's what I'm hearing here in Egypt. I know it's what people are thinking in Morocco. We've already seen about 10 days of unrest in Algeria, unrest yesterday in Jordan. This is a region that where a lot of countries share a similar setup as Tunisia, a hegemonic ruling party, a dictator in power for decades, poor economic performance, poor and worsening socioeconomic relations, and especially rising inequality. The perception and most often the very reality of incredible levels of corruption. And I realize that especially in the US, most people aren't very familiar with Tunisia. But President Ben Ali had been in power for over 23 years. During that time, his family and his in-laws, his second wife, Leila Trabelsi's family, had gotten a piece of pretty much every business in Tunisia, from the main ISP to some of the major private schools to the banking system. It was what we found out. It was we knew the Tunisian system was rotten, but obviously it became so rotten because of the Ben Ali rule that it was hollow and surprisingly easy to topple. This is, I was in Tunisia about 8 years ago, and I've traveled a lot in the Arab world. I've spent quite a long time in Syria under the days of Hafiz al-Assad, one of the most brutal and repressive Syrian leaders in recent history. and never was to Iraq under Saddam Hussein, which probably wins the prize for being the worst alongside Gaddafi's Libya. But Tunisia was creepy. Tunisia was extremely, extremely repressive.
I have to say, I was really surprised. I think a lot of us thought that Ben Ali would stay in a little bit longer. There would be some kind of effort to really hold on to power by any means. But it seems he was a paper tiger. And that way, I think, forces us to really question how stable some of these regimes are. Because the thing about Tunisia is that it was considered to be the most stable of the stable. If we had talked a month or two ago and talked about which regime was most likely to fall at the hands of a popular revolt, I don't think Tunisia would have been in the top five at all. Maybe you saw it coming a little bit more, but I have to say, and that if it can happen in Tunisia, I think what a lot of people are saying, then perhaps it can happen really anywhere else.
No, absolutely, I agree with you on that. No one was predicting the fall of Tunisia. I mean, a week ago, mea culpa. A week ago, in debating this online and offline with people, I thought it would be difficult to happen. I mean, if you know Tunisia, you have a ruling party that actively hired, informants and had representatives in every neighborhood. You had a very strong police and a historically relatively weak army. So the scenario of army intervention, which we did see eventually, seemed dubious, just because the numbers of the police far outnumber the numbers of army officers and soldiers. So it's taken us all by surprise. I think one of the key things in Tunisia, actually, perhaps maybe one of the reasons that it was the first, was that Tunisia, unlike a country like Egypt, you and I are quite familiar with, and I think even Jordan or Morocco, some of the supposedly more moderate, slightly freer Arab countries, there was no room for venting in Tunisia. And when the explosion came, it just took everything out. It's that people, once they plucked up the courage to go out into the streets and protest what was happening, they just continued. I mean, they seemed to be so sick and tired of this regime. And Egypt has had protests for now 6 years, pretty much on a continuous basis, but it hasn't led to anything. And I think maybe one of the differences is that Egypt has allowed people to vent steam over time.
Exactly. And I think a big question is, when the regime starts shooting into crowds, will the protesters disperse and go back home, or will they keep on doing what they're doing? What was amazing in the Tunisian case is that the regime used brute force. We're talking about, some estimates say, more than 60 people were killed by police and security and so on. So for them to withstand those numbers and the countless hundreds wounded or injured, that's really impressive. And I think a big question is, let's say we're talking about Egypt. Let's say the Mubarak regime starts shooting into a crowd of 5,000. What is the response going to be on the part of the protesters? And I think the Tunisians, showed a lot of courage and bravery in saying, we're not going to leave the streets until we get what we want.
And I think also in Tunisia, I mean, I was following, especially over the last 10 days, quite closely what was happening and talking to people inside the country and dissidents outside. And one of the things that happened, I think, was that when the police started shooting at people, especially over, basically a week ago, last weekend, and some of the clashes that took place in the center of the country near Sidi Bouzid, where it all started, but also in Kasserine and places like that. The army hesitated. The army apparently, in a few occasions, intervened to stop the police from shooting at people. Especially, the lawyers' union, which was one of the major forces in the second, third week of the protest, that started participating and giving these protests a little bit of leadership, because they have mostly been leaderless. They protected judges and lawyers that were were threatened by the police. And I think maybe that's one of the little moments that made a difference, that where people thought, oh, hold on, this regime is fragmented. It's not, the army will not necessarily go all the way the police seems ready to go. The regime itself, over the last week, we saw Ben Ali's multiple speeches. First he threatens people and calls them extremists and terrorists and whatnot. And then a couple of days later, it's much more conciliatory. I think the regime apparently incapable of putting of controlling what was happening. I think just encourage people to continue going out onto the streets.
Exactly, yeah. But I mean, I think we should also just offer a note of caution. And I think a lot of people got ahead of themselves on Friday and yesterday. And you really saw the celebratory atmosphere, especially on Twitter, where both you and I were very active in keeping up with events and offering our own thoughts. And I actually remember Sultan Al-Qasimi, who was a columnist for The National. I think he tweeted something along the lines of, "This is the best or most important day in the Arab world in the last century," or something along those lines. And I just got really worried that people were getting a little bit too excited. And yes, of course, there's reason to be optimistic about what's to come. But the big question now is what happens next, because there is a difference between a military coup and a revolution, and it's unclear who's really in charge. What we do know, it seems, is that remnants of the old regime and the ruling party are still very much controlling the levers of power. So it's not a revolution yet, and I think the key question now that not only Tunisians and Arabs have to ask themselves, but also the international community, and particularly policymakers in the US and France, is what happens now and what can we do to play a constructive role in making sure what is now still a revolt becomes a real popular democratic revolution that reflects the aspirations of the Tunisian people. So there's still very, very big question marks now. And this, in some ways, and I think, Issandr, you wrote a little bit about this, this phase is just as critical as what happened on Friday.
Absolutely, I agree. I think one of the issues, I mean, for our listeners who aren't, may not be familiar with the Tunisian political system, currently what you've had is a constitutional transition under the existing constitution. President Ben Ali is now officially no longer president. The Speaker of Parliament, under Article 57 of the Tunisian Constitution, has become President Mr. Mbaza, sorry. And what you have right now is a government that half of which has fallen apart. So some of these people have been arrested, some of the ministers and so on. Certainly the Minister of Interior is on the run. Some of the Ben Ali's closest advisors have been arrested by the army. We heard this morning. It's not really clear who's still in the cabinet. You have a parliament that over 90% of which I think is filled with members of the RCD, of the ruling party. It's a lot of people, the dissidents who are outside of Tunisia, some of whom are just beginning to come back into the country, are saying this government cannot be the one in charge of the democratic transition. These people have a track record of not being democratic. They're also saying that the current electoral laws can't be applied because, for instance, you have very contrived rules about who can stand for the presidency. You have to have a minimum membership of in parliament. It's all of this is being negotiated now. I understand the new Tunisian president has seen a few members of the opposition over the last 24 hours to discuss what can be done. It seems to be moving towards a government of national unity. But at the same time, there's perhaps a more important immediate priority, which is restoring order. There's been a lot of looting, a lot of rioting, accusations that former police officers, former ruling party members are taking place in large-scale looting, as well as attacks, of course, on the villas of regime figures, which might be expected in a revolution. So it's really teetering between the beginning of an orderly transition, which would be the desirable thing, especially if it incorporates all those people who have been excluded from politics before, but also this fear that as the regime falls apart, so does order and security. I mean, people are barricaded in their homes; they're afraid of looters going around. It's quite important and this is what the Tunisian army is trying to do, to make people feel safe and for this democratic transition to take place in a safe environment. Otherwise, it's the law of the jungle.
Yeah, and this brings us to, I think, a critical question, maybe one that's that is a little bit tough to answer, but really important, is what should the Western powers do, in particular the U.S., right now? Mm-hmm. And I know this is an issue where I've differed from some of my colleagues, and I wrote, I believe it was on Thursday, a post for Democracy Arsenal where I advocated a more proactive U.S. response and even suggested that this might be an appropriate time for President Obama to give his Tunisian counterpart a call and be very clear about what the U.S. expects in terms of loss of life and protecting civilians and so on. And I know and there seems to be a lot of debate. Should the U.S. have stayed out as long as it did? And just to give some background, again, to our viewers, at least my perception is that the U.S. did largely take a hands-off role. It didn't really have a statement until a week or two into the wave of protests in Tunisia, and only then it was kind of vague expressions of concern. Then when Secretary Clinton, was in the region last week, she made a statement saying that we're not going to take sides in this, which I thought was an interesting thing to say at that point. Mm-hmm. But of course,
I'd like to interject just to ask you, how did you interpret that statement? Because I think I interpreted it quite differently than you.
My understanding was that she was saying that we're not going to side with the protesters or side with the regime, that it's up to Tunisians to decide their future and so on, taking sort of a non-interventionist approach in the matter. Mm-hmm.
My reading of that, I was taken aback by that statement, because to me, we're not taking sides, talking about a long-standing ally, talking about the place where actually military and State Department people are trained in Arabic, have been trained in Arabic for about 20, 30 years now, the place where, that the United States sells weapons to, the place that MEPI, the Middle East Partnership Initiative, which is one of the main democracy promotion tools, ironically has been based for the last 5 years or so. To say that we're not taking sides and not going to support this regime the way, let's say, France did. France supported the regime until the end. France Minister of Foreign Affairs even kind of inexplicably suggested that France might send riot control police to help the regime maintain order. I think that was a good sign. I think we're not taking sides mean that we're not giving any backing to Ben Ali, and in the context of the other statements that were made about bringing an end to the violence and not the police not shooting the protesters was fairly positive. But I think maybe the difference between your and my perception is maybe one of expectations, in that you have higher expectations of the United States than I do.
That may be the case. And we should also mention what happened after Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia. President Obama issued a statement which I think was a very interesting one, and for me was pleasantly surprising, where he applauded the courage and dignity of the Tunisian people and affirming the right of Tunisians to choose their own leaders. So my initial response when I read that statement was, wow, that's actually a pretty good start. But then the more I thought about it, you know, it's not too hard to come out in support of the winners after they've won. So I think it wasn't a very difficult test for the U.S. I mean, what are they going to say? Ben Ali had already fled the country. It was clear that there would be a change in leadership, and so on. So I think the true test is if the U.S. can get ahead of the game and affirm the right of Arabs to choose their own leaders before the leader leaves. And that, I think, will be, again, you know, I think our expectations, as you've noted, shouldn't be too high in this respect. And this brings us to, I think, some of the internal contradictions that we have in U.S. policy, where we kind of find ourselves stuck right now. We've spent the last 2 or 3 decades consistently supporting these repressive authoritarian regimes. Now that these authoritarian regimes seem less stable, people seem more angry, they want to take matters into their own hands, we can't all of a sudden shift. We have long-standing relationships with these leaders, so we're sort of stuck. In theory, you know, we would probably want, you know, at least from an emotional perspective, to support the aspirations of the Arab people at this very critical moment, but we've put ourselves in a box. We've refused time and time again to distance ourselves from Arab regimes, even though after 9/11 there was pretty much a consensus across party lines in Washington that the status quo was untenable. We've known this for a long time. And it's also common sense. Autocracies don't last forever. So let's get ahead of the game and sort of think about what will that future entail when these regimes finally start crumbling.
Yeah, you know, I think this has been a core, it's almost a philosophical debate, really, for Washington, you know, ever since probably 2002, 2003, when the Bush administration first starting to make noises forcefully about Arab dictatorships essentially being part of the problem that led to 9/11, and then the wider Forward Agenda for Freedom launched in 2005, and we've seen that the United States, whatever principles it may say it upholds, has a real difficulty in translating that into concrete policy. You know, let's say, you know, in Tunisia, what would it have meant to have a more constructive policy before all this happened against the regime? These regimes are quite resilient; they're quite capable of resisting foreign pressure. I mean, does it mean reducing aid? Does it mean more vocal criticism? What really angered me over the last few years, and you know, if you go to my blog Arabist.net and click on the Tunisia tag, I track this down. I've tracked down the people who lobbied for Tunisia, the Washington Media Group that recently actually recused itself. Track down the statements of ambassadors of the State Department on Tunisia, because I know Tunisia. I know, you know, it was an incredibly creepy, repressive place, and I would be just astounded to see ambassadors say. I think a few years ago, the U.S. ambassador in Tunis said this to a magazine: Tunisia is a model for the rest of the region. A model, you know, what, maybe a culinary model, but certainly not a political model. It's, I mean, I think that's the first and really quite important step is that diplomats and officials have to stop praising these countries when they don't deserve praise.
Yeah, I mean, Issandr, I'm not advocating that the U.S. throw these regimes under the bus, and that's not realistic. It's not practical. And from an American perspective, we have to ensure that, you know, we keep U.S. national security interests in mind, and that goes without saying, at least, you know, for policymakers. So, but what we can do, there's a middle ground, I think, between supporting a regime and supporting the opposition. And that's to have a principled policy of pushing regimes to open up space for opposition groups, putting serious pressure on them and saying that one of our conditions for a continued sustained relationship is that you gradually start to open up political space, but not only just to say it to them privately or even publicly, but to back that up. And if it doesn't happen, we make sure that these leaders are aware that there are in fact consequences, and that can be in the form of negative conditionality, positive conditionality. There's different formulas for how this might work. And some of them have been tried before in a number of cases. But I think the key thing is, what can the West do to allow space for the opposition to be opened up and to give people a chance to participate, to protest peacefully, and making sure we stand behind the rights of every Arab citizen to do those things. Unfortunately, it's a little bit late in the game to make that shift all of a sudden, so that's why I think we're in a very precarious place right now. And what I really hope is that people in the Obama administration are watching this very closely, and they're saying, uh-oh, we got to really rethink our Middle East strategy, and we got to do something bold and creative to address these emerging demands of Arab citizens in a number of countries. I'm not going to hold my breath, but it seems to me that right now there's no getting around it. It's 100% clear that the status quo in the Arab world is untenable, and something has to be done, and we have to start thinking about creative ways of addressing these problems.
I agree with you. I just wonder, how do you make that? How do you make that happen? I mean, one thing is that these issues have to be have to start being better understood inside the United States by ordinary Americans. I think by Arab Americans especially. If you look back, Latin America in the 1980s, that wave of democratization, the support of churches in America, the support of the Hispanic American community, I think was quite important in countries like Chile and elsewhere. I think that's, because of the way American politics works, if there's not a domestic voice for it, it's not likely it's going to stay a pretty abstract concept. And that's one thing. And then on the other, I think, there's existing policy tools that the United States and that the EU has. Tunisia was in, for instance, if you take the EU, because it really is the crucial partner more than the United States, at least economically, for Tunisia. It was in the middle of negotiations for advanced status with the EU. The EU never seriously put any pressure on the political component of this in Tunisia. It was quite happy to go ahead with advanced status, because in Tunisia it saw this supposedly stable large middle country with a large middle class, with a lot of entrepreneurship, with a lot of free market system and so on. They could do business with. And obviously that wasn't the case. If I were the French, I would be seriously concerned about some of their economic investments and some of the wrong choices of partners that they've made over time. But not only the French.
Exactly. So here's a very, it's not rocket science. You've pointed to an easy way whereby Western nations can put pressure on Arab regimes. And there was an excellent example, EU-Tunisia, make advanced status for Tunisia conditional on showing improvement on their human rights record. It's not rocket science. I think the real challenge is, do political leaders in the West have the political will to do something like that? Are they convinced or committed to the prospect of democracy in these countries, where they're willing to potentially, shake things up a little bit? And up until now, the answer has been no. Perhaps with one brief exception, the Bush administration in 2004, 2005. And not to get too much into a very contentious history, But Issandr, what I've been noticing in my recent trips to Egypt, and I hesitate to say this, there's a certain current of Bush nostalgia among the Egyptian opposition groups, and not just liberals or leftists or whatever, but also surprisingly Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
So
you've made yourself very popular in certain circles with that line of argument.
Yeah, I know.
It's a courageous one.
But I think this. But I'm not kind of offering my own opinion here. I'm just saying that this is something that I've been noticing more and more in a place like Egypt. And of course, that's not to say people like Bush, but there is a nostalgia for a certain moment in time, for the feeling of optimism that people had, especially in early 2005, where people really felt that anything was possible. And I remember it quite well. I was living in Jordan at the time, and I felt it. There was something different in the air. And at least there was a perception, even if a brief one, that the Bush administration, maybe these guys are actually serious about this whole democracy promotion thing. Where contrast that with the situation now, no one thinks Obama is serious about democracy. In some ways, they've almost given up hope. And that, I think, is one of the key post-Cairo speech stories, that after a lot of optimism about Obama's election, people realize that when it comes to the issue of democracy in the Arab world, which is a very important one for many Arabs, Obama's really not on board. At least he hasn't been yet.
Unfortunately, that last part is true. The Arabic expression "kalam fadi," empty words, and that's the way a lot of people feel about the Cairo speech. Just for the record, I was against the idea of the Cairo speech taking place in Cairo. I think that was a bad precedent to set, because he was giving a lot of prestige to a place that was in the middle. That was back in 2009, but that since 2007 has been regressing quite rapidly, culminating to the last month's elections that were really quite just astoundingly fraudulent. I wrote about in a comment brief that came out about a week ago. I would differ on you. The Bush thing, I hear it myself. I hear people say, back in 2004, 2005, the Americans seem serious about this. And where have they gone now? I think that the pressure on the pressure that did exist at the time on the regimes, you have to put it in the context of the invasion of Iraq, of this perception here in the Middle East that America as this raging bull kind of storming through the china shop of the region as a reaction to 9/11, and this righteous anger that Americans had, that the Bush administration had about 9/11, the invasion of Iraq, this willingness of the U.S. government to go against the UN and go ahead with the invasion of Iraq. It's the talk you are hearing in Washington circles, especially neoconservative circles, about possibly invading Syria, about regime change in Iran, and so on, worried a lot of people. But the Bush administration, towards its end, was as bad as the Obama administration is now, perhaps even worse, because they promised something and then never delivered. And likewise, I think you need to see the perception of Obama in the region now, including on the issue of democracy, within the wider context of the perception that Obama has failed in what he himself set out to do. For instance, in Israel-Palestine, with this policy to end settlement expansion and then walking back from that. I think a lot of these things are contingent. I mean, and throughout this, the U.S. says it has a commitment to democracy promotion, but a lot of the times it's just overtaken by events. I mean, certainly for President Obama, I think the financial crisis was one thing, or just at a complete loss of what to do. Stuck in between these autocrats they've done business with for a long time, and then an alternative that's completely unknown.
Yeah, exactly, and this is where we see tension between interests and ideals, because the Israel-Palestine issue is connected with democracy promotion in the sense that when Obama decided to make the peace process, one of his top priorities in the region, he put himself in a position where he needed or thought he needed the support of these authoritarian regimes. I mean, Egypt and Jordan obviously are the two countries that have a peace treaty with Israel now. So I think the problem has always been the more you put focus on the peace process, the more you think you need repressive regimes to help you out on that, and the less you're going to push on democracy. And that's why, I think it's fair to say, if we were able to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict tomorrow, it might do a lot for our democracy promotion efforts in the region, because you won't have that excuse anymore.
Sure, but I just thought that's not a condition to start on having a better line on democracy promotion. The Israeli-Palestinian...
Well, certainly, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, appears today at a dead end, and it's not clear how it's going to be resolved. Certainly, the Arab perception of the United States' role is quite negative. I think the question is more that we should ask, first, in Palestine, between 2006 and when its mandate ran out in 2009, Hamas was the democratically elected government of Palestine and was marginalized. And that was the first signal in early 2006 of this abandonment of the principle that of promoting free, fair elections, promoting democracy, and so on. That's one thing. And then secondly, you have the problem of now the U.S. really being an impediment to the formation of a national unity government of Palestine that could credibly represent Palestinian interests. But beyond that, the questions that you raised, Egypt and Jordan, I think it's time to ask the question: are they that important to what's going to resolving Israeli-Palestinian peace? We're not, we talk directly to all the players involved. You don't need the mediation that Egypt is carrying out now. I mean, others have done similar things, the Germans, the Turks. And as I wrote recently in this Pomed brief, I think that we need to decouple the relationship, certainly with a country like Egypt, from the Camp David framework and this idea that aid to Egypt is a reward. Aid to Egypt, not only Egypt but also Israel, is a reward for having signed Camp David back in 1979. I mean, this is the thinking under this seems to be that if you stop giving them aid, they'll go back to war to each other, which is obviously not true. No one is interested in war, and it's time to deal with both countries, as you normally would. And in Egypt's case, that means that not using the excuse of the peace process to let the regime get away with things like last month's elections.
Yeah. And I mean, Jordan's a very interesting case because Jordan is actually the second largest per capita recipient of U.S. aid. So we're talking about a very close U.S. ally. And some people are saying that if there's going to be a domino effect after Tunisia, Jordan might very well be, somewhere next in line. And we've already seen, protests the last couple of days. I wouldn't, put too much stock in that expectation, but I think Jordan would be a very interesting case. What if you had a similar situation as to what happened in Tunisia? It'll be much more difficult for the U.S. to extract itself and not take sides in that case when, if I recall the numbers, Jordan has received around $700 million, give or take, over the past year from the U.S. We're talking about a massive infusion of money that's going into the Jordanian regime, which is, it has this image of being a progressive, forward-looking country, but that actually couldn't be further from the truth. Jordan's parliament right now, I don't think I'm exaggerating too much when I say it has zero opposition. There are no opposition parties that have formal representation in Jordan's parliament, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it. 120 seats, zero. It also dropped from being partly free on the Freedom House ratings to not free in recent years as well. So what is the U.S. going to do if people have had enough with the Jordanian regime? That is going to be a very, very difficult test.
No, absolutely, and Jordan is as well such a complicated situation with the division inside the country between, if you want, native Jordanian Bedouins and Palestinians. It's the very clear relevance of what's happening in Jordan to what's happening in Palestine. The fact that Jordan is one of the main centers for intelligence collection and one of the closest intelligence allies of the United States. Its role in as a kind of free zone for Iraqi opposition politicians, and it's such a complex issue, and this is a case again where we're saddled partly with the ties and restrictions that came from past policies, whether from anti-Soviet policies during the Cold War to the dual containment policies against Iran and Iraq during the 1990s, to in the last decade the central role that Jordan has played in counterterrorism and in preparing in generally the running of the Iraq War, and it's very difficult to extricate yourself from this. And the danger is that in a country like Jordan, is if you find yourself, we're looking with Tunisia, that Tunisia is not a particularly important country, it's not really involved in any major regional conflict or anything like that. In Jordan, if you just wait until you get to the situation where the king, let's say, is overthrown and runs off to Saudi Arabia, you're facing a much more explosive situation. And the United States will be again in the position of either siding with the regime or not really being able to say anything and having the moral authority to say anything. And that's a scary proposition. So perhaps thinking about these things should be starting a lot earlier.
Exactly. And now that we've touched on the question of who's next and Jordan being a possibility, Issandr, let me kind of put you on the spot, and what would you predict? What's sort of your outlook for what happens next? Who, if anyone, is most likely to fall, if not in the coming months, let's say in the coming years? And, I'll just kind of offer the note of caution is that we Middle East analysts, I guess we didn't do an amazing job of predicting in the case of Tunisia, which I think goes to show that you can't predict revolutions. They only seem obvious after they've happened, and autocracies seem stable, and then all of a sudden they're not. So it's a very difficult thing to anticipate, which is why I think you should never take the so-called stability of these regimes for granted. Mm-hmm. But with that caveat in mind, what is next?
It's hard to tell, and obviously you have to be careful to dissociate from wishful thinking, which is all from reality. But if you look, let's look at the spark. The spark in Tunisia was socioeconomic, and we're getting warnings at the beginning of the year from the IMF that we may face this year a spike in food prices like the one back in 2008, which caused riots in Egypt and several places. So we're seeing governments quite worried about this. Are they going to be able to afford to continue subsidies? Is there going to be disruption in delivery of, in a country like Egypt that imports most of its wheat, and where it's the one thing, the price of bread is the one thing that in the last 50 years has gotten people onto the streets. Well, that and I suppose defeat in '67 and the funeral of Kulsum. But I don't, living in Egypt and spending a lot of time, I don't get the feeling as much as many Egyptian activists would like to see it. I don't get the feeling that it's happening in Egypt. I think one of the reasons, I mentioned earlier is that there's more, because Egypt is a freer country than Tunisia, there's been more letting off steam. But if we see a protracted presidential transition, what I like to call the Bourguibization of Egypt, in reference to President Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia, who stayed on until he was so elderly that he was removed by a coup that brought in Ben Ali. If you see that kind of fragmentation of the regime with a weak presidency, Egypt is not looking too good, but this is, I think, a 2-3 year timeline. Right now, one of the things that's interesting is I think North Sudan. North Sudan regime completely discredited. A powerful regime, but also a powerful position in a multi-ethnic country, but really discredited by the results of the referendum and the fact that this regime is responsible for having lost half the country in the eyes of many Northerners. That could be one, and already you're seeing some agitation. There's even talk of agitation in Libya, and Libya really is today the worst Arab regime around, I think. I don't think there's any worse, and it's such a sad story. But Tunisia is right next to. Libya is right next to Tunisia. The state is strong, yes, but the state is also has been such a terrible manager of life, and as Tunisians get reacquainted with what's going on around the world after having been under sanctions for I think nearly 2 decades, there might be some movement there. All of these countries are fragile. I mean, all of them suffer from a lack of political legitimacy to some extent, or at some level. I think in Morocco the king doesn't lack legitimacy, but the political system does. In Algeria, the entire system is to a large extent lacks legitimacy. I think in Egypt, after the last elections, its legitimacy has dropped. In Jordan, again, it's I think you're more familiar with, but there's a real sense of frustration that in Jordan especially, it's always one step forward, 2 steps backwards. It seems. They may when things are bad, they let off steam, they open up a bit, and then as soon as the situation changed, then they start contracting again. And again, it's what we saw in Egypt over the last decade. Is that a significant opening in 2004, 2005, and then a real contraction that's taken it in some respects to a worse place than before for the last few years. I mean, where's next? I mean, if I had to pick one place, it's Algeria, because having followed Algeria for a few years, is what you get is a real sense of generalized frustration, and that's similar to that's the most similar to Tunisia, in that people. I mean, it's an incredibly badly run country. It's a very wealthy country, but the wealth doesn't. It's an oil-producing country, but the wealth has never really trickled down. There's enormously high unemployment. There's the core of the regime, which is the military, has started to fall apart slightly, and you've seen, the regime is fragmented essentially between President Bouteflika and the military, and I think that has potential. But considering Algeria's history, both recently the civil war, but also back as far back as the 60s, that could get very, very ugly. I mean, now we're talking about another civil war.
So, Senator, if I had to suggest, who might be next, I think Jordan is a very interesting case in this respect. Not in the same way as Tunisia. I don't think there would be total regime change. The monarchy and the king still have enough legitimacy to survive in Jordan. But I think what you might have happen is something similar to 1988, 1989, where riots and protests about economic conditions forced King Hussein to initiate a democratic transition. And actually, for a while, it seemed very promising. Jordan was really one of the more fascinating cases in terms of moving forward with democratization. It didn't last long, I could be wrong about this, but if I recall, Jordan has had, in 1992, it had the highest Freedom House scores of any Arab country. It had a 3.3. In any case, so I think that's the other model. It's not only revolution or status quo. I think there's a middle option where if leaders see enough pressure from their own citizens, they might say, well, let's preempt their anger and initiate a more democratic political system that incorporates the opposition, holding reasonably fair elections, and so on, which is what you had happen in Jordan in 1989. Of course, the king still sort of stood above all of that and had the final say and veto power over decisions, but at least it seemed to be going in the right direction. So if we're looking at sort of a gradualist model of political change, I think that is a promising one. As for Egypt, I'm glad that you said that we're talking more about a 2 or 3 year timeline. If that's the case, that gives the U.S. a little bit more time to reorient its policy towards Egypt. Revolution is not going to happen tomorrow there. That said, again, that's what we said about Tunisia on December 15th and what would happen. So I think the major takeaway should always be never assume that a revolution is not going to happen very, very soon, because you know what, it just might. And it's not just the revolution, it's what happens after. It's about having a long-term vision, because we don't want to see one autocracy just replaced with another. And that's where I think the international community has a very important role to facilitate democratic transitions and to provide technical expertise, for example, when it comes to reassessing electoral frameworks and things of that nature. So I think there's definitely a role for the West to play. The question is, does it want to play that role? Is it ready to play that role? And we haven't even talked about the big kind of elephant in the room, surprisingly, which is the so-called Islamist threat. Regimes are always going to play the Islamist card and say, you guys really want democracy? Well, then, what happens if the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power? Is that what you want? Yeah. So we might return to that kind of debate when it comes to a country like Egypt.
Sure. I mean, I think that countries like Jordan and Morocco, in a sense, being monarchies, have more leeway because the kings in both countries keep a certain distance from the everyday politics, and can launch reform project, still have that authority if they're and I think what you have to remember is that whether it's a king or a president, actually, decisions from the top can be implemented, and not just when they're repressive, but also when they're progressive, when they're about reforming the system. In countries like Morocco or Jordan or Egypt that have a serious problem with human rights and torture, for instance, I do think that the existing regimes, if they make the decision, can reverse it. I mean, we saw this with in Morocco in the late 90s, when under the previous king, when we went from a extremely repressive Tunisia under Ben Ali-like country to a relatively more open country with a lot less police brutality. So things, like you said, can get underway without a change in actual leadership. The other thing is on this question of what can the West do, what can the U.S. do. I mean, it's hard to implement these changes in long-standing policies. It's hard to come up with the ideas of what works, and you always meet a lot of resistance from the regimes in place, and you always have this idea of foreign interference and so on. And the way I see it is or the way I wish it is that U.S. policy can start off by being a bit like Google, like don't be evil. You don't have to always, threaten with invasion or threaten with aid cuts or threaten with all these different ways, but you can refrain from doing bad things. You can refrain from participating with the security services of these countries in rendition programs and torture and so on. You can refrain from, perhaps deservingly praising a country for economic reform, but then never saying anything about its political situation. It's this one of the things that people resent the most here. I find is the double standards, and that maybe that's the place to put a start. And a lot of people are going to be saying, when President Obama talks about the dignity and courage of Tunisians, which was nice to hear, is, well, where have you been all this time? And I think this signals that you need to have a more constructive policy. It's difficult. It may lead to impediments, diplomatic problems in other areas, but it needs to be seriously addressed.
Exactly. And on that note, I think we may have to close up. Issandr, was excellent talking to you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too, Shadi. Hopefully we need to meet in person now.
Yeah, next time in Egypt, I'll drop you a line and we can meet up. So, and thanks to all our viewers on Blogging Heads TV. Hope you enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye.